Emily woke with a shudder. Her chest heaved heavily, her breathing intermittent. Her skin was cold, covered in sticky sweat. That dream had come back again. In the dream, she couldn't move. Her body felt as if it were shackled by invisible iron, and the room was in an ominous twilight. Someone stood at the edge of her bed, a tall silhouette with empty, endlessly black eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. When Emily tried to scream, her throat constricted, as if an invisible hand was clamping down on her voice. Her heart pounded deafeningly until that silhouette disappeared in the morning sunlight. This had been going on for a week now. It all started when she moved into her new apartment. Old but cozy, overlooking the city at night, it seemed perfect. She worked in the office until late at night and lived alone, enjoying the rare moments of silence. But the silence now frightened her. That night she decided to record herself on camera. She turned on night mode, set her phone on the nightstand, and lay down, hoping she'd see the blank recording in the morning and calm down. But when Emily woke up, there were wet footprints on the floor by her bed. She felt dizzy. She jumped up, turned on the light, and looked around the room. The floor was cold, damp, as if someone had just stood nearby and left. But the door was locked from the inside. With shaky hands, she grabbed her phone and turned on the recording. On the screen, her silhouette was sleeping peacefully. The time was 3:17 a.m. Nothing happened for a few minutes, but then a shadow slowly drew in the corner of the room. It was barely visible at first, but then it took shape. A tall figure with a dark, blurry face approached the bed. Emily didn't move. The figure stood looking at her. After a few moments, it leaned over. The camera distorted the image. Interference flashed. The next thing Emily saw was her own face, close up, as if someone was looking directly into the camera. The tape cut off. A chill ran down her back. She gasped. The phone shook in her hands, but she turned the recording back on, slowed the video down. In the last frames, she saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Moments before the recording cut off, black, empty eyes stared straight into the lens. Emily ran out of the room, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't stay here. Not after this. She spent the night in the car, her body still shaking with fear. In the morning, she went back to the apartment to pack her things. When she walked in, she was greeted by an icy silence. Everything was in its place. Only one thing had changed. On her bed, right on her pillow, lay a photograph. It was of her, asleep. And next to it, leaning in close to her ear, was the same silhouette with black eyes. On the back of the photo was written, "You woke up too early." Emily felt the air become dense, pressurizing. She turned around slowly, feeling someone's gaze. The shadow in the corner of the room was manifesting itself again. She screamed and rushed to the door, but the knob wouldn't budge. The light in the room flickered, and the shadow became more distinct. It was no longer a blurred silhouette. Now something resembling a human stood before her, but its skin was grayish pale, and its lips were moving, as if it were trying to say something. Emily kicked at the door, but her hands went through it like through a thick fog. Cold spilled over her body, stiffening every muscle. "You shouldn't have looked," a voice whispered from all sides. The darkness closed in around her. The last thing she heard was a slow, muffled laugh. The next day, the police opened the door of her apartment. Inside, everything was in its place. No signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry. Only one thing stood out among the perfect order. On the nightstand next to the bed was her cell phone. The screen was unlocked, with the latest video open on it. In it, someone was sleeping under a blanket. The camera slowly zoomed in on the face until the screen was filled with black, infinitely empty eyes. Then the image distorted for a second and something new appeared on the screen. A dark room. A blurry silhouette stood by the bed and looked down. This time the video lasted longer. Emily was no longer in the frame. In the last frame, a hand with long curved fingers slowly reached for the camera, and then the screen went blank. Experts studied the tape for a long time, but found no signs of editing. The official report said the video was just a technical glitch, but here's what was most alarming. The next night, the camera turned back on by itself. The voice in the mirror. Every night when the apartment was quiet, Catherine heard a whisper. It came from the bathroom mirror, a large antique mirror with a bronze frame, as if it were from another century. The whisper was barely audible, like the wind through a narrow crack. At first she thought it was her imagination, tiredness after a long day, the emptiness of the apartment that could drive her crazy. But every night the voice became more and more distinct.
Catherine.
It sounded one day. It was a gentle, almost caressing pronunciation of her name that sent a chill down her spine. She stood in front of the mirror, dazed. Her own reflection stared back at her, but the eyes were like someone else's. Catherine exhaled, trying to quiet the shivering. She turned off the bathroom light and hurriedly closed the door. The voice never came during the day, only at night, only in the bathroom. He was cautious at first, like he was studying her. He told her little things she couldn't know in advance, which street the lights would go out, which of her neighbors had left the door open. Catherine could not understand how he knew these things. Gradually, the voice became her companion, a quiet counselor she was beginning to trust. "You look tired today," he said one day. "Maybe it's time to change something in your life." Catherine was surprised but brushed it off. "It's just a whisper. It's nothing special," she tried to convince herself. But the whisper knew too much. One night, a voice asked, "Come closer." Catherine frowned. Her heart beat faster. She leaned over the sink, looking directly into the mirror. For a moment it seemed to her that the reflection was moving out of step with her movements. It smiled, oddly, unnaturally. "Who are you?" she breathed out.
I am you.
The voice whispered. "Only different. Let me be there for you. I'll make your life better." Catherine stepped back, dizzy. She didn't know whether to believe her eyes. The reflection seemed to tease her. It tilted its head and looked straight into her soul. The next day, she decided not to look in the mirror. She covered it with an old blanket so that she couldn't see her own reflection. But the voice continued, even from beneath the fabric. It became more insistent. "You have to give me more freedom," it kept saying. "I can change everything. You'll be happy, successful, strong." She covered her ears, but the words penetrated her head. Catherine felt like she was losing control of herself. She was haunted by nightmares in which her reflection came out of the mirror and became her, while she remained trapped inside. One day, gathering all her courage, Catherine decided to destroy the mirror. She took a hammer and walked over to the bathroom. The mirror seemed calm, its surface smooth, as if nothing strange had ever happened. But when she raised her hand, the reflection began to move. "Don't do it," came a voice, now loud, threatening. "You don't even realize what's going to happen." "Stop it," Catherine shouted, swinging, but her hand froze. The mirror trembled like water and her reflection stepped outside. What stood before her was a copy of her, exact, down to the smallest detail. But its eyes were empty, devoid of life. The creature smiled, watching her confusion. "You're just a reflection now," it said, before Catherine felt something pull her back. The mirror's surface enveloped her, pulling her inside. She screamed, resisting, but her arms and legs felt paralyzed. The last thing she saw was a replica of her, calmly emerging from the bathroom and smiling her own smile. Now Catherine is trapped in the mirror. She sees everything that happens in her apartment, but she can do nothing. Her doppelganger lives her life, subjugating everything she loved. Sometimes at night, he returns to the mirror, looks directly at her, and smiles as if to remind her,
This is my life now. But Catherine doesn't give up. She waits for the moment when she can whisper her name to someone else.
Emily and James had just moved into a cozy apartment on the third floor of an old brick house in the city center. At first glance, the place seemed perfect. Quiet, friendly tenants, and a well-maintained entrance. But something about their neighbors across the hall felt off. The couple across the hall never left their apartment. Emily noticed the windows were always shrouded in heavy, dark curtains. Whenever she heard footsteps in the hallway, they were unnervingly rhythmic, too precise, as if mannequins were pacing just beyond the door. It wasn't long before unease began to creep into their perfect new life. James decided to break the ice. On their first day, he knocked on the neighbor's door. Minutes passed before he finally heard soft, deliberate footsteps. A faint voice came through the door. "I'm sorry, but we're not accepting guests," the voice said. It was dry but polite, almost robotic. James chuckled nervously and retreated. "I guess they're just introverts," he said to Emily that evening, brushing off the encounter. But Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered after hearing the voice. Weeks went by, but the mystery of the neighbors deepened. One evening, while Emily was preparing dinner, faint voices drifted through the kitchen vent. She froze, straining to hear. "Do you remember 1923? A man's voice asked. It was low and steady, filled with nostalgia. "Of course," a woman replied. "Boston was so different back then." Emily's brow furrowed. The way they spoke felt old-fashioned, like something out of an old movie. She tried to rationalize it as an odd coincidence and told James over dinner. He shrugged. "Maybe they're watching some historical drama," he suggested. But Emily wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, the voices returned. This time, Emily recorded them on her phone. When she played the clips back for James, the unease in his expression mirrored her own. The neighbors' conversations were bizarrely specific and unsettling. "Do you remember how we survived the Great Depression?" the man said in one recording. "Yes," the woman replied, her voice wistful. "But everything became easier when we moved into this house. It's like time stopped here." James finally admitted, "That's not normal." Late one night, Emily and James were startled awake by a loud crash in the hallway. Peeking through the peephole, they saw the neighbor's door slightly ajar. A single flickering light spilled into the corridor. James hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. "Let's just take a quick look," he whispered. Emily reluctantly followed. Inside, the air was cool and still. The apartment felt frozen in time. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting faint glimmers of light on antique furniture. A grandfather clock ticked softly, though its hands hadn't moved. The walls were lined with faded photographs, each one featuring their neighbors, unchanged, in settings that spanned decades. Emily picked up a picture frame. The caption read, 1937, Central Park. The neighbors looked exactly as they did now. "This doesn't make sense," Emily whispered. Before James could respond, the door creaked shut behind them. Turning, they saw the neighbors standing in the doorway, their expressions calm, but their eyes piercing. "You shouldn't have come in here," the man said, his voice steady and cold. The neighbors led them into the living room, where they sat on an ornate sofa that looked as though it belonged in a museum. The man sighed, clasping his hands together. "We are not like you," he began. "This house is a sanctuary, a place where time stands still. Those who choose to stay here gain immortality, but it comes with a price." The woman's voice was softer, almost soothing. "We cannot leave. The world outside has moved on, changed beyond recognition. We no longer belong to it." James's hands clenched into fists. "What do you mean, we? We're leaving." The woman's faint smile sent a chill down Emily's spine. "You can't. Now that you know the secret, the house won't let you go." Emily and James ran back to their apartment, but the moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut and refused to budge. The windows were no longer windows, but solid, impenetrable walls. Their phones had no signal. Time itself seemed to bend and warp around them. Panic set in as they realized their reality had shifted. They were prisoners now, just like the neighbors. Outside their walls, the muffled voices of their immortal neighbors carried on, speaking of decades long past, as if nothing had changed. Emily sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "We're stuck here," she whispered. James wrapped his arms around her, his own expression one of quiet despair. From across the hall came a single haunting sentence,
"Welcome to eternity."
The mystery of the vanishing house. In a small village lost in time, there was a legend about a house that appeared only during the full moon. The old people said that the house seemed to appear out of nowhere. One moment it was just a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. And the next moment you were looking at an ancient building as if it had stepped out of the pages of a Gothic novel. No one knew who it belonged to, and no one who entered it ever came back. For Mark, a journalist in search of a scoop, this legend was the perfect opportunity. His career hung in the balance, and the mysterious house promised to be the story that would bring him back to the top. He had spent a long time preparing for the trip, studying the stories of the locals, gathering rumors and even a few old photos of the house, taken, according to eyewitnesses, decades ago. When he arrived at the village, silence and desolation greeted him, as if the place had long since been abandoned by life. The full moon promised the appearance of a house, and Mark waited impatiently for nightfall. As soon as the moon rose, Mark set off toward the wasteland. The air was perceptibly colder, and there was a strange silence all around. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Suddenly, a house appeared in front of him, as if out of nowhere. It was tall, dark, with a pointed roof and windows that looked like empty eye sockets. Mark felt a slight chill, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He pulled out his camera and started filming. The house looked like it had been built hundreds of years ago, but its condition was too good for such an age. For a moment he thought one of the windows flashed with a faint light. "Well, time to go in," he muttered to himself. The door yielded surprisingly easily, as if the house had been waiting for him. It smelled damp and old wood, but there was no dust or signs of age. The hallway greeted Mark with a huge staircase that led the eye upward into the darkness. There were paintings on the walls, portraits of people whose faces were vaguely familiar, though he couldn't remember where he'd seen them. He decided not to go straight upstairs and began his inspection on the first floor. The rooms were filled with objects that seemed to belong to different eras. In one, he found a table with an intricate pattern that was definitely Victorian. In another, a rocking chair covered in crackled leather with a magazine on the seat. The magazine looked brand new, but the date on the cover said 1927. "What the?" Mark ran his hand over the pages. Suddenly, he heard whispering. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the whispering grew louder and louder, turning into separate words. "Help! Don't go!" Mark turned around, but no one was there. His heart beat faster, but he decided to continue. This was the stuff of his life. When Mark got to the second floor, things got even weirder. The rooms began to change. He entered one, but when he opened the same door, he found himself in another. The corridors became longer and longer. The walls seemed to shift, creating a labyrinth. The paintings now depicted scenes that cut to the bone. A fire where people were screaming, a dense forest where eyes glowed in the darkness, the face of a woman whose eyes were full of tears. Each room revealed something personal to him. On the wall of one of them, he saw himself as a child, standing in front of his grandmother's house. It was his happiest memory, but the picture suddenly darkened, and the child disappeared, leaving behind an empty house. "It's impossible," he whispered. Mark realized that the house was reacting to his fears and memories. He felt small and helpless. The voices grew louder. There were more and more of them, and now they spoke different languages. He tried to get out, but every door led him back inside. His camera began to behave strangely. It was recording scenes he hadn't seen with his own eyes. Dead people walking down the hallway, shadows following him. The words, "You're next," flashed across the camera screen. After a few hours that seemed like an eternity, Mark found himself at the same door he had entered through. It was open. Behind it was a vacant lot, flooded with moonlight. But as he took a step, the door slammed shut right in front of him. No one has seen Mark since. His camera was found in the vacant lot, and the last entry had the caption, "Home takes its own." Soon the villagers began whispering again about the house appearing on the full moon, but no one else dared to go inside. You're reading this. You've already taken the first step, but you feel like you're in control. It's just a text, just a story. You're reading because curiosity is stronger than anxiety. But why does it feel different with every line? Why do you sit a little more tense now? Why does the air in the room feel heavier and the light of the screen a little colder? Have you checked the room? Maybe just a glimpse. You looked around quickly, without realizing you'd done it. Maybe even smiled, trying to convince yourself that everything was okay. You're alone, aren't you? There was a man reading the same text. He didn't pay attention at first, but with every passing minute, he felt something was wrong in the room. A slight tremor in the air, something invisible pressing. There was no sound, no movement, just a strange, almost physical sensation of looking. A tingling in the back of my neck, as if someone was standing right behind me. Can you feel it? Just check it out, just slowly. He tried to ignore the feeling. Read on. And then his screen blinked. Literally for a second, so fast he could write it off as a mistake. He didn't even realize it right away. But then he realized something had changed in the reflection of the screen. Did you check your screen? I did. Maybe you even felt a chill. It happens sometimes. In those moments, the air feels a little thicker, a little quieter, like something's waiting. He turned off his computer, went to wash his face to ward off the strange tension. When he lifted his head, looking in the mirror, he saw that his reflection had frozen for a moment. Didn't repeat the movements immediately, just a fraction of a second late. That was enough. You didn't check your reflection? I probably shouldn't, because if you see a delay, you won't be able to see it again. You can make yourself forget. You can convince yourself it's a trick of the light or fatigue, but the reflection will remember. The feeling didn't go away. He went to sleep, but in the night he awoke to a strange sound. It was as if someone had whispered his name right next to his ear. His heart was pounding, but the room was quiet. He decided not to think about it. But how do you not think about it? How can you convince yourself that you just heard the wind or the creaking of furniture when you're torn inside by the feeling that it was real? You didn't hear anything strange, did you? Of course not. Just if you do, don't get up. Don't turn on the light. Just lie still. Sometimes it goes away. Sometimes. The next night, he had a dream. Or he thought it was a dream. He saw himself sitting at his computer, reading text that seemed familiar. Everything looked exactly the same as it did now. But then he saw it. In the corner of the screen, barely discernible, was a figure. Blurry at first, like it was just a blur on the monitor. But it moved. It became clearer. It was watching. Did you check your screen again? Did you look in the corners? Good for you. But here's the thing. If you see movement once, a glimpse, don't be too quick to react. Sometimes they notice it. Sometimes that's what they're waiting for. He woke up in a cold sweat. Everything was in its place. Only his phone was lying screen down, though he remembered leaving it otherwise. He didn't bother to check it, just flipped it over and turned it off. Turned on the TV, the radio, anything to keep the silence at bay. But the fear remained. It wasn't outside anymore, it was inside. You're still reading. That means the presence is closer. It knows that you know, it's patient, it's always patient. You can close this text, you can try to forget. But now, when the screen goes out, you'll know it's there. Have you noticed how your breathing has slowed? How your fingers are a little less mobile? It's a normal reaction, a sign of awareness. It's not the first time you've felt it, but it wasn't so clear before. It's different now. Have you noticed how sometimes your computer turns on without you doing anything? How your phone lights up even though there are no notifications? You used to write it off as random, but there's no such thing as random. It's been watching, waiting patiently. Maybe right now you're not alone anymore. If you hear a whisper behind you, don't turn around immediately. If the screen blinks again, don't turn it off. If something changes in the reflection, don't look too long. All you have to do is pretend nothing is happening. Sometimes that works, sometimes it does. But now that you've read everything, it knows you know. It's gotten as close as you let it. You're the one who gave it a chance to come in. You're still reading, that means it's close. You can get up, turn off the light, go to bed and convince yourself it's all just text. But can't you feel it? The darkness has gotten denser, the air a little heavier. The feeling of someone else's gaze doesn't go away. You try not to think about it, but the more you try, the more distinct it becomes. You can ignore it, for now.
But sooner or later, you're gonna have to turn off the screen. And the second the light fades, you'll feel it standing right next to you, and you'll realize you're not alone anymore.